I want to talk to you a little bit about what's on the phone. All the phone contains images of Margaret before and after her death, as well as videos of your son with her. With her, engaging in acts with her. Was she still alive when he was doing that? No, I don't believe. Oh my God.
What drives a teenage boy to spend 2 hours in the dark with a corpse? In the quiet town of Wadsworth, Ohio, police discovered a scene that would haunt them forever. 98-year-old Margaret Douglas, stuffed into her own closet, her nightgown torn, her dignity stripped away. But it wasn't just the murder that shocked veteran detectives. It was the killer's phone. Inside a locked folder named Dark, protected by the password murder, they found videos taken between 2:09 a.m. and 4:10 a.m. The footage revealed a teenage boy, just 17 years old, documenting unspeakable acts with a jar of blackberry jam. He lived just 5 houses away, worked at the local pizza shop, and would have stayed longer if not for knowing his mother would wake at 5 a.m. What turned an ordinary teenager into something so monstrous? And how had such darkness grown unnoticed in the heart of small-town America? Spring in Wadsworth, Ohio was usually a time of renewal. In 2018, as winter melted away and flowers began to bloom, the small community of about 24,000 people went about their daily lives just as they always had. Among them was Margaret Douglas, a remarkable 98-year-old woman who had called this town home for over half a century. Margaret wasn't your typical elderly resident. At an age when most would need constant care, she lived independently in her modest home on Post Road, tending to her beloved garden and caring for her cherished dogs. Her neighbors often saw her collecting her mail or taking out her own trash, displaying a fierce independence that had carried her through nearly a century of life. Born in 1919, Margaret had lived through some of history's most defining moments. She had witnessed the Great Depression, World War II, the moon landing, and countless other historic events. As one neighbor would later recall, she wasn't what you'd expect when you think of a 98-year-old woman. She was strong, she was fierce. Margaret had a simple dream: to reach 100 years old, a milestone that seemed well within reach given her remarkable vitality. Her home on Post Road held 50 years of memories. After her husband passed away, she had refused suggestions to move into assisted living. This was her home, filled with photographs, garden tools, and the comfortable rhythms of a life well lived. She was known throughout the neighborhood for her kind heart, having once served as a babysitter for children who were now in their 80s themselves. But in April 2018, something unusual happened in this quiet corner of Wadsworth. Neighbors noticed Margaret's porch light, which usually illuminated the evening darkness, had remained unlit for several days. Her daily routines, checking the mail, tending to her garden, had suddenly stopped. In a close-knit community where neighbors looked out for each other, these small changes set off alarm bells. David, a longtime friend who had grown up near Margaret and had become something of a caretaker in recent years, was the first to raise concerns. When his knocks on her door went unanswered, an unsettling feeling began to spread through the community. Margaret Douglas, the woman who had survived nearly a century of history, had seemingly vanished from her own home. The initial response was one of concern rather than alarm. After all, this was Wadsworth, Ohio, a place where serious crime was rare, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where a 98-year-old woman could live independently without fear. Perhaps she had gone to visit family, some suggested. Others wondered if she might have fallen and needed medical attention. As police began their preliminary inquiries, no one could have imagined the dark truth that would eventually emerge. A truth that would shatter the community's sense of safety and raise disturbing questions about evil lurking in the most unexpected places. The disappearance of Margaret Douglas was about to become more than just a missing person case. It would become a story that would haunt Wadsworth for years to come. The spring breeze that rustled through Margaret's beloved garden now carried with it an unspoken question. What had happened to the strong-willed woman who had lived through nearly a century of history? The answer would prove more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The morning of April 6, 2018, brought a new intensity to Wadsworth's normally peaceful streets. Police cruisers moved slowly through the neighborhood, their presence drawing curious faces to windows and porches. The disappearance of Margaret Douglas had transformed from a welfare check into something more concerning. Detective Sarah Miller led the initial canvass of the neighborhood. Starting from Margaret's home, teams of officers went door to door, building a timeline of when residents had last seen the 98-year-old woman. Each conversation revealed small details that, like pieces of a puzzle, began to form a troubling picture. "I noticed her porch light was off," said Eric, who lived 2 houses down. "Margaret was like clockwork with that light. Every evening at dusk on it would go. But it had been dark for days." Others shared similar observations, small disruptions in the predictable patterns of Margaret's life that now took on new significance. The Scotts, a couple who had known Margaret for years, provided their own insight. "She was definitely with it," Mrs. Scott told detectives, "though sometimes she'd tell us different ages when we spoke. But she was strong enough to take care of herself, taking out trash, getting her mail. That's what makes this so strange." As officers worked their way through the neighborhood, they encountered a particularly chatty resident, a muscular man whose initial defensive posture belied his eagerness to talk. "This neighborhood isn't what it used to be," he insisted, launching into a lengthy complaint about rental properties and changing times. "We've lived here 18 years, and I used to know every neighbor. Now, I barely know anyone." The investigation team methodically checked security cameras, interviewed mail carriers, and searched nearby areas where Margaret might have wandered. But each lead seemed to circle back to her house, where her coat still hung and her comfortable shoes remained items she would never have left behind voluntarily. Howard Leisure, Margaret's nephew, joined in the search efforts. Along with his wife Cindy, Howard had maintained close ties with his aunt, though they respected her fierce independence. When David, Margaret's friend and informal caretaker, reported that she hadn't answered her door, Howard's concern deepened. The 911 call Howard made revealed the growing anxiety. "Yes, this is Howard Leisure. My aunt lives on Page Street. A friend of ours stopped over there yesterday to check on her, and she was nowhere to be found. We don't know if you found anybody wandering." The police response intensified. They began checking every backyard, every shed, every possible place where a 98-year-old woman might have sought shelter. The community joined in, organizing search parties and sharing information on social media. Local news crews arrived, their presence adding to the growing sense that this was more than a routine missing persons case. The breakthrough, when it came, was devastating. Howard had returned to Margaret's house for another thorough search. In the bedroom closet, something caught his attention. Later, he would describe the moment to investigators. "I couldn't pick up the shoe. I'm thinking, what's holding the shoe? So I took and grabbed another piece of clothing, threw it back. I've never seen this before in my life." What Howard touched felt strange, cold, clammy, like styrofoam to his fingers. As he moved more clothing aside, the horrible reality became clear. Margaret Douglas, the woman who had survived nearly a century of history, who had lived independently and brought joy to so many, lay dead in her own closet. The discovery transformed the missing persons case into a homicide investigation. Crime scene technicians descended on the house, their cameras flashing as they documented every detail. The initial examination revealed signs of violence that shocked even veteran officers. Margaret hadn't simply died, she had been killed, and the manner of her death suggested something far more sinister than a random act of violence. The community's reaction was immediate and profound. Neighbors gathered in small groups, sharing their shock and fear. Parents kept their children indoors. The easy trust that had characterized life in Wadsworth began to erode as people faced the reality that a killer had walked among them. Detective Miller established a command center in the local police station, where timelines and photographs soon covered the walls. The critical question wasn't just who had killed Margaret Douglas, But why anyone would target a beloved 98-year-old woman who had never harmed anyone in her long life? As news of the murder spread, more details emerged from the neighborhood. A woman who walked her dog in the area recalled seeing two men loitering nearby, one significantly younger than the other. She remembered them discussing foul play and making comments about Margaret B., a nice person who didn't deserve that. More disturbing was the evidence found at the crime scene. Margaret's body showed signs of both violence and something else, something that investigators initially hesitated to discuss publicly. The killer hadn't just taken her life. They had committed acts so depraved that they would later shock the entire community. The investigation was about to take an unexpected turn, leading detectives down a path that would reveal how close to home the evil really was. As one officer would later remark, "In all my years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything like this. The person who did this, there was something deeply wrong with them." Meanwhile, just 5 houses away from Margaret's home, a teenager named Gavin Ramsey went about his daily routine, posting on Snapchat and attending school, while hiding secrets that would soon come to light in ways that would devastate multiple families and change Wadsworth forever. The quiet neighborhood that had been Margaret's home for half a century now held its breath, waiting for answers that would prove more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The question wasn't just who could have killed Margaret Douglas. It was who among them could have harbored such darkness in their soul. In the same neighborhood where police searched for Margaret Douglas's killer, 17-year-old Gavin Ramsey appeared to live an ordinary teenage life. He had grown up just 5 houses down from Margaret, in a home where his mother tried to keep him on a straight path despite his increasing troubles with the law. At first glance, Gavin seemed like any other high school junior. He worked at the local pizza shop, had an on-and-off girlfriend named Maddie whom he'd known since 1st grade, and spent time with his best friend Braden. But beneath this normal exterior lurked something darker, something that even those closest to him were only beginning to glimpse. He was never actually happy. His coworker Hillary would later tell investigators. He just faked it. During their shifts at the pizza shop, Gavin would confide in Hillary about feeling empty inside. He spoke of plans to catfish people online, not for money or pranks, but with the specific intention of luring them into situations where he could hurt them. Gavin's troubles weren't entirely hidden. By age 16, he had already accumulated a felony and 5 misdemeanors. His mother, struggling to control his behavior, had moved his bedroom downstairs near hers, hoping his younger brother would tattle if Gavin tried to sneak out. She restricted his freedom, limiting him to work and home for 3 months at a time. But Gavin found ways around these restrictions. He would sneak out at night, breaking into cars throughout the neighborhood. When later questioned about these break-ins, he gave a response that chilled investigators. "I don't really take anything. I just like to look inside." This admission suggested something more disturbing than typical teenage theft, a pattern of violation for the thrill of it. His online presence revealed more red flags. In group chats with friends, Gavin would make disturbing statements. "I could kill someone and not feel anything," he once wrote, adding that he wouldn't act on it because he knew it was wrong. When his girlfriend Maddie responded with shock, he brushed it off as a joke, but the comment lingered in everyone's minds. Perhaps most telling was Gavin's application to work at a local funeral home. The timing of this application, shortly before Margaret's murder, would later take on sinister significance. Though he wasn't hired, his interest in working with the dead raised questions that would later haunt investigators. As police investigated a string of local carjackings, they found themselves interviewing Gavin about an incident involving an older man he'd met on the dating app Grindr. Gavin admitted to carjacking the man but claimed it was vigilante justice, punishment for an adult willing to meet with someone who'd identified themselves as underage. During this initial interrogation, Gavin sat between his mother and a male officer, while a female detective asked questions. His behavior was notably strange, fidgeting with tissues, alternating between emotional outbursts and calm manipulation. When discussing his crimes, he showed more concern for their impact on his family's reputation than for his victims. Unknown to investigators at the time, Gavin's phone held dark secrets. In a locked folder named Dark with the password Murder, he had stored disturbing media files. His search history showed an obsession with local crimes, particularly Margaret's disappearance searches made before her death was public knowledge. His personal writings, found in a purple notebook under his bed, revealed more troubling signs. The first pages contained research on notorious serial killers, particularly those known for necrophilia. These weren't just casual interests. They were detailed studies that would later prove relevant to the horror discovered in Margaret's home. Gavin's friends noticed changes in him. Maddie would check his Snapchat location at 3 a.m., finding him in random locations despite his curfew. At a movie theater, he told friends he wouldn't care if someone held a gun to Maddie's head. He would just watch. These casual comments about violence and death created an unsettling pattern that friends struggled to understand. His relationship with his parents was complicated. After one fight with his father, Gavin attempted to choke himself, whether as manipulation or genuine distress remained unclear. His mother's responses to his behavior ranged from strict control to apparent denial, often focusing on his language, stop cussing, rather than addressing his deeper issues. While investigators worked to solve Margaret's murder, Gavin posted a Snapchat showing police cars outside his window with the caption, "That's crazy." He searched online for updates about the case, then carefully deleted his search history. But digital forensics would later recover these deleted searches, showing his morbid interest in the crime he had committed. The parallel investigations, the carjackings and Margaret's murder, would soon intersect in ways that would shock the community. As one detective noted, sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't the ones hiding in shadows. They're the ones hiding in plain sight, behind ordinary faces, living in ordinary houses, just down the street from their victims. The quiet neighborhood of Wadsworth was about to learn that the monster they feared wasn't some unknown intruder. It was a teenager who had grown up among them, walked their streets, and harbored darkness that would soon reveal itself in ways that would haunt the community for years to come. As investigators pieced together the evidence, they began to see how Gavin's escalating behavior, his fascination with death, and his need for thrill-seeking had culminated in one of the most horrific crimes in Wadsworth's history. The question wasn't just how he could have done something so terrible, but how many warning signs had been missed along the way. The interrogation room at the Wadsworth Police Department had seen its share of criminals, but nothing quite like this. Gavin Ramsey sat in a chair, his lanky teenage frame hunched forward, alternating between rocking back and forth and lying on the floor in a fetal position. The female detective who had first questioned him about the carjackings was back, but this time, she knew far more than Gavin realized. "Did you know I'd be coming to see you after we got your phone?" she asked. Gavin's response was telling. "I figured as soon as I heard the knock on the door. If my boots were tied, I think I would have ran." Outside in the lobby, his mother waited, unaware of the full horror her son was about to confess. The evidence from Gavin's phone had changed everything. The digital forensics team had discovered a locked folder named Dark, protected by the password murder. Inside, they found something that shook even veteran officers: videos and photographs documenting the last moments of Margaret Douglas's life and the unspeakable acts that followed. The first video showed Margaret asleep in her living room, filmed from inside her house. Another captured her final moments, a gloved hand visible around her throat. But it was what came after her death that revealed the true depths of Gavin's depravity. For 2 hours, between 2:09 a.m. and 4:10 a.m., he had stayed with Margaret's body, committing acts of and documenting everything on his phone. In the interrogation room, Gavin's demeanor shifted between emotional outbursts and eerie calm. "I'm upset," he told the detective. She responded with practiced empathy. "I know. Telling me about it isn't going to give you much relief." When questioned about entering Margaret's house, Gavin attempted to minimize his actions. "I thought I was going out that night to go through some unlocked cars," he claimed. "But instead, I saw Margaret sleeping through her window. Her back door was unlocked. If it was locked, I wouldn't have gone in." He described tripping on a chair, waking Margaret, and claimed her screams led to panic. "She reached for her phone, so I strangled her," he said matter-of-factly. The detective noted how he showed more emotion about potentially going to jail than about taking a life. The interrogation revealed disturbing insights into Gavin's mindset. He spoke about adrenaline being his true addiction. "Nothing feels wrong with me when I have adrenaline," he explained. "It's like everything's all right. You feel alive." When asked about remorse, his responses seemed rehearsed, using what psychologists call dead phrases. Empty words without genuine emotion. "I'm really sorry that I did all of this," he said mechanically. "Were you sorry before you got caught?" The detective pressed. "Yeah, like I constantly think about it a lot," Gavin replied, but his words rang hollow. When asked what he would say to Margaret if she were alive, his response was equally superficial. "I'm sorry, that never meant to happen. If I could take it back, I would." The most chilling moment came when discussing the purple substance found on his gloves. Gavin's embarrassment seemed more genuine than any remorse he'd shown for the murder. The detective had to carefully extract the truth about how he had used blackberry jam in his acts of Throughout the interrogation, Gavin's concerns remained self-centered. "I know it's going to ruin our family name," he worried. When discussing the aftermath, he focused on his own feelings. "I didn't really feel like anything had changed or had happened. I just continued to break into cars and drink and smoke dope." Meanwhile, in the lobby, Gavin's mother was about to face her own horrifying reality. When officers finally explained what they had found on her son's phone, her first question revealed the gap between perception and reality. Was she still alive when he was doing this? The evidence painted a picture of methodical horror. Medical evidence indicated it would have taken several minutes for Margaret to die. Gavin had stayed in her house for hours afterward, only leaving because he knew his mother would wake up at 5 a.m. and he needed to pretend to be asleep. The investigation revealed more disturbing details. In Gavin's room, they found Margaret's red wallet tucked beside a bottle of cologne stolen from another carjacking victim. Trophies from his crimes. His mother's words about him being compassionate and loyal to a fault now seemed like desperate denial in the face of mounting horror. As the interrogation concluded, the detective made one final observation that would prove prophetic. "Unfortunately, I think you would have hurt more people if you hadn't been caught." Gavin's response was chilling in its honesty. "I mean, it wasn't in my plan, but I could see that happening. The case had broken wide open, but the revelations weren't over." As investigators dug deeper into Gavin's background, they would uncover a pattern of escalating behavior that suggested Margaret's murder, as horrific as it was, might have been just the beginning of something even darker. The confession had answered the who and how of Margaret's murder, but the why, the depth of darkness that could drive a teenager to commit such acts, remained a question that would haunt the community of Wadsworth for years to come. The discovery of Gavin's purple notebook, found hidden under his bed, opened a window into a mind far darker than anyone had imagined. Its 70 pages began with what appeared to be research papers on notorious serial killers, Ted Bundy and Donald Gaskins, with particular attention to those who had engaged in necrophilia. But what started as apparent research soon morphed into something more personal and disturbing. "This writing thing is new to me," Gavin's first journal entry began innocently enough. But the words that followed revealed a troubled mind. "I hate being at home. I hate being downstairs with my family because a lot of the time I feel like I don't really belong here. I can contain my thoughts and urges most days, but sometimes I just want to go off on someone and beat them until they're not breathing anymore." The journal painted a picture of someone struggling with severe emotional disconnection. "I honestly want to take someone's life," he wrote. "I want to know what that would feel like. What it would feel like to stand over some dead body." More disturbing was his self-awareness. "I don't feel empathy or sympathy for anybody. I wouldn't feel bad if I killed someone, but I don't want to sit in prison." His writings gradually evolved from dark thoughts to specific scenarios. He created what he called skit ideas, horror movie plots featuring his best friend Braden as a potential victim. One entry read, Introduction. Braden is playing at the park, and I am a murderer plotting how to kill him. These weren't just creative exercises. They were fantasies that seemed to grow more detailed over time. Digital forensics revealed even more disturbing patterns. Gavin's phone contained searches about Margaret Douglas before her death was public knowledge. On the day she went missing, when his mother texted about increased police presence in the neighborhood, Gavin replied casually, Well, that's Wadsworth for you. Then immediately searched for Wadsworth police reports, Margaret Douglas dead, and body found in Wadsworth, Ohio. His online conversations with friends showed a pattern of testing boundaries. To his coworker Hillary, he wrote, "I honestly have two emotions and they're angry or laughing. I'm never really happy. I'm just faking it." He described watching videos of self-harm and feeling nothing but amusement. "I could kill someone in cold blood and not feel guilty or sad about anything," he confided. The relationship with his mother emerged as particularly complex. During his first interrogation about the carjackings, before the murder was discovered, Gavin broke down crying about disappointing his parents. "I'm costing them thousands of dollars. Constant heartbreak. I honestly probably never made either of them proud." His mother's response was telling. Instead of addressing the emotional content, she simply said, "Stop cussing." Investigators discovered that Gavin had been prescribed Zoloft in January 2018, just months before the murder. His mother would later attempt to blame the medication for his actions, claiming he became more aggressive after starting it. But records showed his violent thoughts predated the prescription. The medication hadn't created these impulses, it had simply failed to control them. Perhaps most chilling was Gavin's fascination with adrenaline. During questioning, he described it as his true addiction. "When this drug kicks in, it's a sense of euphoria. It almost feels like you have increased energy and strength. You feel practically invincible." He explained breaking into cars and homes not for theft but for the thrill. "That risk factor, all I've ever done is take risks because that's the only thing that makes me feel." The investigation also uncovered disturbing behavioral patterns from his childhood. He had chased his siblings with knives when he was younger, and at age 9, there were records of him being a victim of a sexual offense, though the details remained sealed due to his age at the time. His girlfriend Maddie revealed more warning signs. Once at the movies, while she was away getting popcorn, Gavin told their friend Rachel, "If someone came in here and pointed a gun at Maddie's head right now, I wouldn't do anything. I would just watch." These casual comments about violence, combined with his lack of emotional attachment, painted a picture of someone who had long struggled with basic human empathy. The application to work at the funeral home took on new significance in light of these revelations. It wasn't just a job application. It was part of a pattern of fascination with death and corpses that would ultimately lead to his horrific acts with Margaret's body. Experts who reviewed the case noted that Gavin's behaviors aligned with classic warning signs of developing psychopathy. Early cruelty to others, lack of empathy, thrill-seeking behavior, and the ability to maintain a normal facade while harboring violent fantasies. His journal entries showed he understood his actions were wrong but felt no moral restraint against committing them. What made the case particularly disturbing was how these dark impulses had coexisted with normal teenage life. The same phone that contained evidence of his crimes also held ordinary text messages with friends, homework assignments, and typical teenage social media posts. It was as if two Gavins existed, the ordinary teenager who worked at a pizza shop, and the predator who stalked the neighborhood at night, looking for opportunities to feed his darkest urges. This duality would later become central to the debate over his eventual sentence. Was he a troubled teen who could be rehabilitated? Or had he revealed himself to be, as the judge would later describe, irreparably corrupt? The Wadsworth County Courthouse had seen many trials over the years, but none quite like this. In November 2018, as Gavin Ramsey faced the judge, the gravity of his crimes hung heavy in the air. The 17-year-old who had committed one of the most horrific murders in the town's history would be tried as an adult, facing charges that read like a nightmare. Aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, kidnapping, and gross abuse of a corpse. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had Gavin's confession, DNA evidence, and the disturbing contents of his phone. But it was the additional evidence that painted the full picture of horror. The blackberry jam used as lubricant, the 2 hours spent with Margaret's body, the videos and photos he had carefully documented, storing them in a folder password protected with the word murder. Gavin's defense team, facing insurmountable evidence, built their strategy around two key elements: his age and his medication. They argued that Zoloft, prescribed just months before the murder, had increased his aggressive tendencies. His mother became their star witness, tearfully telling the court, "If I could change one thing, I would never have agreed to put my son on Zoloft." Before this, his mother testified, "Gavin was loyal to a fault. He's compassionate. And this thing we're sitting here discussing is not who my son is." Her words rang hollow against the evidence, particularly when prosecutors pointed out that Gavin's journal entries about wanting to kill someone predated his Zoloft prescription. The defense also brought up Gavin's own trauma. Records showed he had been a victim of a sexual offense in 2009 at age 9. While the details remained sealed, they argued this early trauma had shaped his development. But prosecutors countered this argument effectively. Many people experience trauma, they noted, but they don't commit philia with 98-year-old victims. The most powerful moments came during the victim impact statements. Margaret's great-niece addressed the court. "Had he not been caught, I have no doubt that he would continue to escalate his crimes and continue killing. I believe he planned to kill numerous people. He used my aunt as a warm-up, so to speak." Her words proved prophetic, echoing the concerns investigators had expressed about Gavin's potential to become a serial killer. The prosecution's presentation of evidence was methodical and devastating. They showed how Gavin had stayed in Margaret's house from 2:09 a.m. to 4:10 a.m., leaving only because his mother would wake up at 5 a.m. They detailed how he had strangled her, taking several minutes to end her life, then proceeded to violate her body in ways that shocked even veteran courtroom observers. When Gavin finally addressed the court, his statement provided no real answers or closure. "I don't know how to explain why all this happened," he said, reading from a prepared statement. "I don't think there is an explanation to begin with. I think about it all the time. I take it back in a heartbeat if I could." His words seemed rehearsed, lacking the emotional depth one might expect from someone facing the consequences of such horrific actions. The judge's decision was unequivocal. Describing Gavin as irreparably corrupt, he handed down the maximum sentence: life without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for aggravated burglary, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse, all to be served consecutively. But the story didn't end there. A new Ohio Senate Bill, SP 256, would later abolish life imprisonment without parole for juvenile offenders, even those charged as adults. This meant that despite his life sentence, Gavin would have an automatic chance at parole after 25 years. The law sparked intense debate, with supporters arguing that juvenile brains aren't fully developed, while opponents pointed to cases like Gavin's as evidence that some crimes deserve permanent consequences. Margaret's family was devastated by this development. The relief they had felt at his life sentence evaporated with the realization that Gavin could potentially be free when he was just 42 years old. The amount of relief when we found out that he had life without parole was immeasurable. One family member said, "That relief is now gone because of Senate Bill 256. The family's fears weren't just about justice. They were about safety. We know that if we put our true thoughts in our impact statements, Gavin would read them," they explained. "We discussed the risk of giving him fuel for the rage he carries inside him. Knowing that at some point he might be released while my siblings and I are still alive, the case raised difficult questions about justice, rehabilitation, and the balance between punishing horrific crimes and recognizing the special circumstances of juvenile offenders." As one prosecutor argued, maybe that's true for certain cases like drug-related offenses, but in these types of cases, someone who has a propensity to become a serial killer and then gets out in 25 or 30 years. I don't agree with that at all. As Gavin was led away to begin his sentence, the courthouse emptied, but the questions remained. Could someone capable of such calculated evil ever truly be rehabilitated? And if released, would society be safe? The answers would have to wait until at least 2043, when Gavin would face his first parole board, a date that Margaret's family now dreaded.